Welcome back to my live stream. I'm just going to do my quick check here to see that streaming on YouTube. Let's see, am I? Yes, I am. Am I? Yes, I am. All right. Good stuff. Excuse me while my mustache tickles my nose and I get prepared for today's conversation, which so far I have very little idea. Well, some people on Twitter were asking me about Venus cycles and war. So I thought I would veer into that cheerful topic. Excuse me, my nose really is ticklish for some reason. Okay. Where to begin? Where to begin? Just put some slides in order here. Okay, that can go down there. Okay, and of course, before we go any further, I want to remind the viewer that if you have not watched my YouTube video, Introduction to the Venus synodic cycle, then you might not know what I'm talking about. It's a good idea to watch that video. It's only about 11, 12 minutes long. Makes for a really good introduction. Hopefully makes the whole concept really clear, outlines it properly, and then you watch my live streams and I sort of show you some examples of how that all works in real life, in history, in astrology, and so on and so forth. Tracy loves the color of the wall. Well, this is temporary, Tracy. I've mentioned this before. My dad had a health crisis, so I had to come to my hometown and help my mother look after him, but he's in good condition now, stabilized, and I'm going to be heading back to Vancouver soon. But for the time being, I'm in Montreal, and for the time being, I've got this yellow wall behind me, and I'm glad you like it. I'd be rather disappointed if you didn't. Anyway, on to the astrology here. I'm going to share my screen with you guys, as I always do. And all right. Gonna get rid of this thing for the time being. So just very quickly, when the First World War broke out in 1914, the faces you see in front of you are the faces of some of the leaders of countries involved in the war. Of course, the US didn't get involved until 1917, so I'm really limiting this to mostly Europe, and then you can see Japan's thrown in there because they were also involved. But just a quick run through. The king of Serbia was a red 3. Part of the reason the war broke out was because of this tension between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you had Peter, the king of Serbia was a red 3. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, was a red 3. Raymond Poincaré, the president of France, was a red 3. King George V of Great Britain was a red 1. But his prime minister, when the war broke out, Herbert Asquith, was a red 3. Okay, King Albert of Belgium is a white 1. Belgium was, of course, invaded by Germany, which was what brought Great Britain into the war. And then the Emperor of Japan at the time was a red 5. The King of Greece was a red 3. Now, Greece wasn't involved in they were. It's kind of complicated. Prior to the war we think of as the First World War, which was Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia, with later the Americans. That really followed on the heel of these other Balkan wars, which Greece was involved in. But because the Greek royal family had ties to both the German and Russian royal families, i.e., they were brothers or sisters, or at the very least cousins of those other two royal families, which were at war. It was ostensibly sort of neutral. Although, as with all other things, it's hard to be neutral when the whole continent is at war. Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary was a white 3. So you can see there are a few white intervals in the mix, and he's the most consequential one. Out of the really big powers, he's the only one who isn't a red interval birth, because you can see next to him, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany was a red 2. And then, as I've already mentioned, the president of France, the Tsar of Russia were both red 3s. And the king of Britain was a red 1, and his prime minister was a red 3. I've got Ottoman Turkey, Bulgaria, and Italy there as well. These were all sort of players in this situation, but ultimately they're sort of caught up in the orbits of those greater powers. And my point in showing this is just to sort of, like, if you've watched the introduction to the Venus synodic cycle video, you've seen that there are 20 intervals, that each of them only occurs, once every 8 years for about 146 days. So there are these fairly small intervals of time, but I find it very curious. I'm going to show you like a whole sort of load of examples of how you tend to see like a lot of red interval births, a disproportionate number of them, when you get to a lot of these really sort of critical periods in history where, if you think about it, this is really like during wartime, especially during the world wars, because even the US is under sort of, war powers limitations, and all the sort of rules are changed. Everything becomes a lot more autocratic because, because everyone's fighting a war. And so the people who are in charge, like the heads of state of these countries, are just that much more powerful at these times, because everything's a bit more sort of ruthless and with lives at stake and all that. So you really see sort of the most political power in the hands of the fewest people at times like this, and especially when it comes to these world wars. Now, the First World War ended 4 years later, and there were some changes, and these are what the changes reflect. Of course, there was the Russian Revolution. So the Tsar of Russia and his family were murdered. Remember, he was a red 3. So now he's been replaced first by Kerensky of the Provisional Government, who's a red 1, and then later Lenin, who's a red 4. Aside from that, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, remember, who was a white 2, he's died off during the war, and he's replaced by his nephew, who is a red 5, Karl I of Austria-Hungary, although that empire soon sort of dissolves like all the others. Wilhelm's still there, but of course, his empire also dissolves. But the king of Bulgaria has switched over, and now there's a red 4 king of Bulgaria. They find themselves on the losing side. So it's even more, there are even just a few more red interval heads of state at the end of the war than there were at the beginning. And Woodrow Wilson was a black 2, if anyone's asking. I know usually, like I said, I'm looking at these European powers. I'm just going to check on can't wait for my black 4 talk. Okay. Yeah, not sure when I'll get to black 4. I pick apart the intervals as I go along. So yeah, this is just a grid that shows you, the emphasis on red intervals over other interval births when it comes to these leaders at these times. And I'm going to show you, basically, when you get to the Second World War, you really get the same deal. Yeah, this is what I'll show. So these are national leaders at the outbreak of World War II. At the top left, you have Miklos Horthy of Hungary. He's a red 3. He's kind of a dictator of Hungary at the war's outbreak. He's a red 3. Edvard Beneš of Czechoslovakia is a red 3. Those of you who know about the Hitler took the Germans into the Sudetenland, this sort of part of Czechoslovakia that had German speakers in it, and he said that was all he wanted. And there was this big conference. If you've heard the word appeasement sort of thrown around, that was over the settlement of like, yeah, sure, Germany can keep this one part of Czechoslovakia because he's not going to take anything else. And people wanted to believe him, and well, everything unfolded from there. So top left is Horthy of Hungary, red 3. Then Beneš of Czechoslovakia is a red 3. Then we get to Albert Lebrun, who's the president of France, and he's a red 5. Then we get to Winston Churchill, who's a red 2. Now, of course, Churchill isn't prime minister right when the war breaks out. He becomes prime minister in May of 1940 as things get really hot. And I'll go into sort of the intricacies of the British government during wartime and how many red intervals are involved there, because it gets really kooky then. Franklin Roosevelt is a blue 4. Leopold III of Belgium is a black 5. Metaxas of Greece is a black 1. Boris III is still king of Bulgaria. He's a red 4. And then we get to the big guns here. We've got Hitler as a red 1. Stalin is a blue 2. Mussolini is a blue 5. And Hirohito of Japan is a blue 1. So almost everyone are red and blues. Like, okay, Belgium and Greece are sort of, the outliers there. But, they really just have to deal with people coming in through their country. They're not invading anyone. But when you get to the really big powers there, most of them are either red or blue intervals, meaning these are the places where Venus and the Sun are closer together by either exterior or interior conjunction. Let me see if I've got any questions yet. I love that people are starting to know their intervals. It's a good start. Okay, so I've talked about those leaders. Now I'm going to just go into British prime ministers, because this also gets quite kooky. Sorry, just make this so you can see. Actually, this one I think I can play even. Yeah, I'm still in the middle of working on it, so some of it looks a bit sort of, I gotta put those pictures in alignment. But long story short, okay, these are the rising and setting. Actually, let me go back a bit just to make this introduction have a little build up to it. These are the British prime ministers. Every single one we've had going. The Guilford, who you see second from the left at top, he was the prime minister at the time of the American Revolutionary War, and then every other prime minister who's been in office since him is depicted there. So I just go back to the Revolutionary War, and then that first prime minister, Walpole, he's a good few decades before Guilford, but he's considered the first prime minister. So I've just got him in there to sort of bookend. Eventually, this will be a list of everyone who's ever been British prime minister, but for the time being, I've got a few decades of the 18th century that I still sort of need to work into a better version of this graph. But even here, we've got, in other words, we've got 250 plus years of the men and women who have been prime minister of Great Britain. This is them depicted by sun sign. And okay, you can see there've been 5 Pisces and 5 Libra prime ministers, and there's like 6 others where you've got 4 of them. There's only ever been 1 Scorpio prime minister, it seems, in this time that I'm looking at, and that's Percival, who's the only prime minister who's ever been assassinated. Interestingly enough, the only British prime minister to be assassinated was the one lone Scorpio sun they've ever had in office. So that's a little interesting factoid. They've only had 2 Sagittarius prime ministers and 2 Cancerian prime ministers. Let's see, who would those be? Oh, yeah, well, Winston Churchill, of course, is one of those Sagittarians, and then Disraeli is the other Sagittarius, and they're both considered quite important, both conservative prime ministers, both serious about empire, and we'll get into a little bit of that. probably. And then who are the two Cancerian prime ministers? Um, Douglas Home and then Heath. Okay, well, the first one, Alec Douglas Home, you just see the initials there, ADH. He was prime minister really for barely a year, I think just exactly a year. After Macmillan resigned because of the Profumo affair, and then before the election of Harold Wilson's Labour Party. And then Edward Heath was a Conservative prime minister who served two um, uh, non-consecutive terms. That's the term I'm looking for, in the 70s. Anyway, or wait, no, he just served one term. It's Wilson who served non-consecutive terms on either side of Heath. My apologies to you Brits who are probably getting mad at the Canuck for screwing up your history. Anyway, let's get into the Venus stuff. So this is all the British prime ministers by Venus sign. Okay. So no British prime minister, it seems, has ever had Venus in Capricorn, at least not for the period that I'm covering. Only one has had Venus in Libra. That's Cameron, whose nickname is too vulgar for me to repeat in a live stream in public. So anyway, it's somewhat disproportionate with Venus by looking at these prime ministers by their Venus signs, somewhat disproportionate. Definitely certainly there have been a lot more prime ministers with Venus in a fire sign, since like 7 of them have had Sagittarius and 6 have had Leo. But it's interesting the way it's disproportionate. But now we're going to go to where it really starts to get disproportionate, is when we start looking at the Venus phases and then the intervals. So these are the same British prime ministers by their phases. You can see there are nearly twice as many setting phase prime ministers as there were rising phases. So that many more of them, 27 setting phase, 27 prime ministers born during the setting phase of Venus, and only 15 prime ministers born with Venus in the rising phase. And you can see certainly that the setting A and the setting D phases far outweigh proportionately the number of prime ministers born during them, including the most recent ones: Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, the 3 prime ministers of 2022. So we've got 2 setting Ds and a setting A just in that mix-up as well. But it's interesting how that seems to be a very consistent Venus phase, or a pair of very consistent Venus phases for the British prime ministers. But here's the big buildup. Here's where it's really kooky. Intervals. Because intervals are small. There are 20 of them. In an 8-year cycle, we have the 20 Venus intervals. So now when we see sort of this really disproportionate distribution, it's more striking than if it's just zodiacal, where you have 12 signs, and or the phases where you have 10. And this allotment of the Venus intervals amongst all the prime ministers, it's a lot more skewered, I find. Well, visibly, I think that's quite obvious. There certainly have been more red interval prime ministers than anyone else. 17 red interval prime ministers, as opposed to only 5 prime ministers born in white intervals. Only 8 prime ministers born during blue intervals, and only 12 prime ministers born in 12 intervals. Well, that's sizable. The black is sizable, but still red far outweighs. There have been more red interval prime ministers than blue and white combined, for instance, or just as many red interval prime ministers as white and black combined. So, that's where this, the proportion amongst these different intervals really becomes a lot more sort of striking and uneven, and where you can now just imagine if, as astrologers, if you were talking about planets and signs, then you would really, if you had this many, say, fire sign prime ministers, or this many prime ministers born with, Venus in a cardinal sign. If it was disproportionate, in those kinds of categories, I think a lot of astrologers uh, would really make something of that, and rightly so. I mean, it would, it's the kind of thing we look for, where, if the red intervals was, say, the fire element, then we'd say, oh wow, the British prime ministers tend to be fiery or something of that nature. Now, I haven't associated those sort of qualities to the intervals just yet. I'm sort of working them in gradually, but it's not something I've done sort of a thorough job of yet, as I'm uncovering them, um, and learning them as you are. Um, but yeah, there's something to that, and that's part of what I'm following here. Um, Now, the other thing that I think is sort of interesting about the distribution of the red intervals amongst these prime ministers is when we get to sort of the war years, it's especially concentrated. Um, I'll just look at it this way so that I can use my mouse. But these two guys, well, these three were, um, sorry, when the First World War, it was Asquith, Red 3. He came in to replace Bannerman, who didn't serve too long. He was elected and then he got sick, and Asquith took over. He was prime minister at the outbreak of the First World War, and then halfway through the war, he was replaced by Lloyd George. Now you get Bonner Law, who really serves a very short amount of time, and he's replaced by MacDonald, who's elected. And it goes through two blue intervals during the 30s. And then you get, of course, to the war breaks out, and it's Churchill, who's a red 2. He's replaced at the end of the war by Attlee, who's also a red 2. Attlee is then voted out for Churchill again in 1951. And then when Churchill retires, he's replaced by Eden, who's a red 1. And then Eden, in turn, has to resign due to the Suez scandal, and Macmillan becomes prime minister, and he's red 4. So there's this long stretch of time where red intervals are prime ministers of Great Britain right at the time when, during that period between essentially the real breakout of the First World War, the Battle of Britain, when Churchill becomes prime minister, right up through the decolonization period. I mean, Macmillan is the prime minister during, the whole sort of, as the British Empire's various African nations are declaring independence and what have you. It started when Attlee was prime minister and India was declaring independence. Right. Okay, just trying to think of what to talk about. Any questions so far? How are we doing out there? Okay. I'm just going to pause this for a minute because there's a lot of distracting noise, and I'm having trouble concentrating. I think that's going to be it for today. This isn't a very successful stream, but it's very distracting. There's noise that I can't control. I'll see you folks on Sunday and try to pick this up from there with Patrick Watson. Then, of course, I'll be back on Monday. All right, folks, have a great day.